And today we're going to start with Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is one of those chapters that students often get confused in, and they often sometimes struggle with. So please make sure you work the problems, work the homework, make sure you understand the homework, work some of the problems we work in the quizzes, and make sure you even work the problems on the quiz notes. I give you quite a bit of problem solving to do in this chapter. Again, most of the problem solving is optional unless it's the homework or the quizzes. But it would probably be worth some investments of your time to work those problems. And if you're struggling with them, just send me an email and I can help you out with some of the answers or where you're struggling. But it's one of those chapters students struggle with. Some observations, some kind of my feedback from Chapter 2 that I noticed when I'm kind of looking over quiz notes, I'm looking over how well you do on quizzes. Just a reminder, make sure we always understand the difference between constant and increasing opportunity cost. A constant opportunity cost means there's going to be a straight line PPF. And this is what we're going to do in Chapter 3. With an increasing opportunity cost is we see that bowed PPF. That was more Chapter 2. Why we're going to use the straight line in Chapter 3? Because it keeps the math simple. And we want to make sure that I don't lose any of you on what we do mathematically. There is not I don't want the class to be a math class. So you should have the skills to do the math. There is nothing, as I typically say, more than 8th grade. Some other observations I noticed about the quiz is that if you choose to do the quiz notes, you have until 30 minutes after your quiz is done to submit those. So that means you have to do the notes before the quiz, not after. The notes are there to help you and to make sure you're prepared for the quiz. They aren't kind of meant to do after the quiz. I would prefer all of you do the quiz notes ahead of time. They're kind of, I'll help you out. They are the test review. At the end of the semester, at the end of this module, I'm probably not going to put out a test 1 review because I do as we go along in the chapter. That's what the quiz notes will be. The quiz notes really are the test review. So they're one and the same. So do them. Second thing, what I noticed is I have students waiting to the last minute to do your quiz. Again, that's entirely up to you. Just know that if you wait to the last minute, you have risk. And the risk you can't fix because you're out of time. So if you wait to the last minute, you'll run out of time. So if you have a computer failure, somehow Respondus won't download for you, and you're trying to get your quiz done. If you're sending me an email at 10:30 on Friday night, there's not much I can do for you. If you get me ahead of time, we can work through your problems, and we can solve some of these risks of bad internet connections. Being kept late at work. I said, students said, well, my boss kept me late, so I couldn't get home to do the quiz. Do it before you go to work. You have an extended amount of time to do the quiz. You have all week to do the quiz, so please do them early. I will put quiz 4 notes out this week. Some of you work well ahead, and that's okay as well. Most of the slides are out there. The only thing you're missing is some of this discussion. So if you're struggling going over the quiz notes, you need help with the discussion, that's what I'm here for. So let's move then into Chapter 3. Chapter 3, what we're going to deal with is we're going to talk about trade. And we're going to talk more specifically about free trade. Always a reasonably controversial activity. I'm not real sure why, but I am. We'll talk about some of the cost and benefits of trade. Just like everything, there's going to be cost and benefits. And we're going to talk about why we see some people are for trade and why we see people are against trade, and how we as citizens should view trade, and we should understand what we're giving up with trade and what we're losing and what we're gaining. And so we're going to talk about this interdependence of trade. So that's what this chapter will talk about. They're there for every chapter, just kind of the objectives. So let's talk about this. What do we mean by interdependence? In trade and in the world, we have interdependence on the rest of the world. What do I mean by interdependence? For my life, I rely on many people from around the world. Most of them I've never met, nor will I ever meet. And what these people do for me is they provide me with goods and services. So this world is integrated, especially today, and that we're going to rely on lots of people who we've never met to provide me with goods and services. And because they do this, it allows us to come through with this statement that trade can make everyone better off. And we're going to talk about why people, and more specifically nations, choose to be interdependent. I don't have to be interdependent. I can attempt to be self-sufficient. And what does it mean by self-sufficient? Is I don't rely on anyone. If I tried to be self-sufficient, my world would be very, very poor. Because if I was self-sufficient, the only things I could have on this world were things that I could produce on my own. So we as individuals can't be self-sufficient. We don't have enough knowledge and skills to be self-sufficient. I guess we could. If we want to live on probably in a very small cabin in the middle of the woods with no running water, no electricity, yes, we probably could be self-sufficient. And there are some people who choose that life. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that's what they choose, that's what they choose to be. Most of us choose different things. So we should look at that and follow through with that and why we're interdependent. So the example we're going to use from class is I'm going to take a little different one than the one used in the book. In the book, they use a farmer and a rancher, and you're more than welcome to use that one. And in fact, I would suggest you read through that one. It follows similar to what I do here, but I try to give mine more to help you a little bit with the homework and a little bit with kind of the quizzes that are going to come about. So we're going to go through and we're going to talk about two countries, Japan and the United States, two goods, airplanes and soybeans. I got my goods right today. I made sure of it. And they're only going to use one resource, labor. Okay, so that means there's no machines in our economy. Again, why do we use assumptions? They just make life easier. Okay, in the College of Business, we offer another class called International Economics, and we expand our assumptions in international economics to more than this. We come up with almost the same result. It just makes life a little harder, and we get into a little more details exactly of how trade works. But in principles, we're just going to take this big, kind of tall view of it, kind of make it very simple so we can understand exactly kind of what's happening, or kind of the idea behind it. So what we want to do is we want to determine how much of both goods each country produces and consumes in two conditions. One, what can they consume and produce if they're self-sufficient? And two, what can they produce and consume if they decide to trade with one another? So, example one, the United States. The United States has 50,000 labor hours per month available. So we have people available to work, and I just gave you some magic number of labor hours. We did not look them up. This is just an example. That's not an exact number. I don't spend a lot of time looking at exact numbers because numbers change year to year. But we should have kind of this general idea of where things are. So here we're just going to use a basic number, 50,000. Why? It makes life easier. And we have two goods, airplane and soybeans. So for an airplane, what we're going to need is 500 labor hours to produce it. To produce soybeans, we're going to need 10 labor hours. So with this information, what we can do is we can plot out the US PPF. So what we have is enough labor to produce 100 airplanes or 50 or 5,000 soybeans. And because it's constant, we have a straight line PPF. The easiest way to do this, solve for the endpoints, draw yourself a straight line. So the United States then can produce, again, anything on the line, or if we wanted to, we could be inside the line. Right? We cannot produce out here. We can only produce inside the line. So very simple example. Suppose the US is without trade. The fancy term for this is called autarky. So if you ever see the term autarky, that means without trade. It means we're self-sufficient. So the United States is self-sufficient. That means we produce our own airplanes and soybeans. I just picked a point in the middle. Doesn't have to be in the middle, but I just picked a point for simplicity, in the middle. So if we're self-sufficient, what that means is that our consumption equals our production. So we can only consume then what we produce. So sometimes we refer to this as the consumption's possibilities frontier equals our production's possibilities frontier. So that's for the US. Now let's go on the other side. Let's talk about Japan. So Japan has fewer people in the United States. So we represented that by a little less on the labor hours. Okay. So Japan has 30,000 labor hours. An airplane requires 625 labor hours in Japan. And soybeans need 25 labor hours in Japan. So if we look at this, we can talk about how the US is more productive in both of these than Japan. And we'll talk about what exactly the term we use in a second. So let's build a PPF for Japan. So if Japan uses all of its hours to produce airplanes, all 30,000, how many airplanes could they produce? If they use 22,500 hours in airplanes and 7,500 in soybeans, how much could they produce? 15 and 15? And we just kind of do it nice and simple. So we just kind of gave 5 points here so you can see where these numbers come from. So let's look at them. So 30,000 gives us 48 airplanes. How did we get that number? How did I get from 30,000 labor hours to 48 airplanes that could be produced in Japan? Very simple. You take 30,000 and you divide it by, well, let's go back. We divide it by this number right here. We divide 30,000 by 625, and we get 48. And we can do that continuously through scenario So we divide this by 625, 625, 625. We get our airplane numbers. How do we get our soybean numbers? Well, we go back and we see that soybeans require 25 labor hours. So we would divide then by 25. And that gets us these numbers. So that's how we would convert labor hours into output. So when you're working your homework, you will go through an example and they will work on how do I get these numbers? Well, here's how we move from labor hours to production. So again, start at the endpoints. First thing we do is plot the endpoints. And then from the endpoints, I can draw a straight line down. So that's how we would create Japan's PPF curve. And just like the United States, we just picked a point here in the middle for Japan. We can see what they could produce if they are self-sufficient. Or they are in autarky. So Japan's there in the middle. So here's kind of the baseline. So without trade, we're going to start here at the baseline. Here's what we get. The US gets 50 airplanes, it can get 2,500 tons of soybean. Japan, 24,600. So we have our baseline. So the question I usually ask students is, how do we prove trade to be beneficial? How do we show that trade is helpful? How can we show that we benefit from trade? So the way we show that we benefit from trade is we have to prove this statement. We have to prove that consumption without trade is less than consumption with trade. So if we can consume more after we trade than we could before, that means we're better off. So if consumption increases, we're better off. So that's our goal. Is we have to show that the US and Japan, without changing anything that we have, so there's no change in what they can produce. How do we show they're better off? Well, can we? What if the US is richer? Right? So in our example, I made it as hard as possible. I made the US richer than Japan. How do we talk about richer? The term we're going to use to kind of indicate richer is absolute advantage. Absolute advantage means I am more productive. I have the ability to produce a goods and service using fewer inputs than another producer. So let's look at our example. So if we looked at our example, for 1 ton of soybeans, I need 10 labor hours in the United States and 25 in Japan. So what that simply means is that the US is better at producing soybeans than Japan. The term we use, better at producing, is the absolute advantage. So if I have the absolute advantage in soybeans, that means I'm going to be richer in soybeans. If I have the absolute advantage in airplanes, which the US does, right? They only need 500 labor hours, while Japan needs 625. So that means the US can produce more airplanes with the same number of labor hours as Japan. So what that means is the U.S. is going to be richer. They're more productive. So I set this up hard. I didn't give us the easy one. The U.S. is better at everything. They're better at soybeans. They're better at airplanes. So if they're better at everything, is there a way? Is there a way for them to trade? Well, there is. And we're going to talk about where they can gain trade from. The U.S. is better at both goods. So what does Japan do? How do we determine what Japan produces to trade to the United States? How we're going to determine what Japan produces or specializes in is that's going to be determined by what they produce at the lowest cost. So specialization is going to be related to cost. I can see some of you thinking, but Dr. Walsh, had you put any dollars and cents up there? How are we going to find cost? Same way we always find cost. We're going to examine the opportunity cost. So I'm going to skip this part. When we talk about opportunity cost, we no longer are talking about absolute advantage. We are talking about comparative advantage. So when we talk about what do we have the comparative advantages, is we're going to look at opportunity cost. In fact, the definition is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. And based on our comparative advantage, that tells us what we will specialize in. So I specialize in what I have the lowest opportunity cost. So let's calculate an opportunity cost then. So let's start with the United States. And when we talk about opportunity cost, we do not talk about dollars and cents. We talk about what we give up. And here, since we have no dollars and cents because we don't need them, all we have are airplanes and soybeans. So if I decide as the United States to produce airplanes, what am I going to give up? So if I put all the labor hours needed to make one airplane, 500, what could I have done with those 500 labor hours? Well, if I didn't make an airplane, I could have used those 500 labor hours to make soybeans. Well, how many soybeans could I have made? Well, I take the 500 that I would have needed to make an airplane. I divide it by 10 because that's the number of labor hours needed to produce soybeans. And I find in the United States that in order to make an airplane, I have to give up 50 soybeans to do that. On the flip side, if I make one soybean, it's actually 1 ton of soybean, we'll just call it soybean, how many airplanes must I give up? So to find the first one, it's going to be 50 divided by 10. To find this one, it's going to be 10 divided by 500. And what that shows us is, in order to produce a soybean, I have to give up 200 of an airplane. Now, students ask me, well, Dr. Walsh, how can I write it? I don't care how you write it. You can write it as decimals, write it as fraction. Most of you will use your calculator, so you're probably more inclined to do decimals. If you don't use your calculator, I use fractions. I use fractions a lot because I don't keep a calculator on me. When I teach this in class, it's kind of weird to walk around with a calculator, so I try not to. So I won't have a calculator here. So it takes me sometimes a little longer to solve it. But if you're comfortable with a calculator, please use it. If you don't have to, you don't have to. But I do allow you to use a calculator on all your tests. Because I'm not trying to get you worried about math. You need a calculator, use a calculator. I don't frown upon usage of it at all. Okay? If you have to use it, I can't solve that problem now. So let's talk about Japan. We would do the exact same trick for Japan. So one airplane was 625. A soybean was 25 labor hours. I take 625 divided by 25. I get 25 soybeans. I take 25 divided by 625. I get 4/100ths of an airplane. So I've calculated the opportunity cost now for the United States and for Japan. There's another way to do the opportunity cost. So this is the opportunity cost. I say we'll talk about it from labor hours. Not always will I give you labor hours. Instead, you might just simply get a PPF curve. And what you'll get with the PPF curve is you'll always get the endpoints. So here the endpoints are 100 and 5,000. So what do I do with those? Well, what you do is you write a sentence. And with the sentence you write is the two endpoints. 100 airplanes equals 5,000 soy. If I want to find one airplane, I simply divide each side by 100. And when I do that, I get one airplane equals 50 tons of soybeans, which is exactly what we got before. So not always are you going to always have all the information available. You might just get a PPF curve, because that's really all the information you need. You need the labor hours to find the PPF curve. But if you have the PPF curve, we can solve from there. So 100 airplanes equals 5,000 soy. Divide each side by 100. I get one airplane equals 50 soy. If I wanted to find for soy, what's one soy get me? Well, it's just like before. Instead of dividing by 100, I'm going to divide by 5,000. And that equals exactly what we found before. So when we talk about comparative advantage, we're going to have to calculate the opportunity cost. So kind of look. So if the number of soy here is bigger than airplanes, then this should be less than 1. If the number, see here, so airplanes is less than soy, that number should be greater than 1 for airplanes. So one airplane should cost more soy, and hence one soy should cost less airplanes. That's kind of a way to check yourself to make sure you did the division right. A lot of times students struggle with the division. If you follow the sentence or you follow kind of the way I did it here, you should never struggle. Because if I want to get one airplane, I just get to 1. If I want to get to 1 soy, then I get to 1 soy. That's how I get to 1 soy. I divide by 5,000. So the easiest way I find to do it is to write your equation here. You can always get to 1 that way. So a couple of quick points we should notice with this. Is it possible for the country to have the lowest cost in everything? The answer to that is always no. So impossible to have the comparative advantage in all goods. So it will always be impossible for that to occur. Why is that? Well, if you looked at these numbers, so one airplane is 50 soy, and one soy is really 1/50th of an airplane. Now, if you look at 50, and 1/50th, what you notice is that they are something you learned in 8th grade called reciprocals. And there's a property in reciprocals that can prove that it's impossible to have the comparative advantage in all goods. We're not going to go through it. But if you really like math, you really want to prove stuff, you can prove that. You just need to know that because they're reciprocals, it's impossible to have the comparative advantage in both goods. And in fact, what happens if we multiply reciprocals together, we come up with 1. So let's get back to our example of the US and Japan. So what I did on why we were talking here is I also solved the opportunity cost for Japan. Japan, 25 soybeans for airplanes, 400th cost of a soybean in airplanes. So let's look at these numbers. Japan has the comparative advantage. Why? Because 25 is less than 50. So Japan will produce airplanes. So Japan is going to specialize in airplanes. Now what about the US? The US has the lower cost in producing soybeans. 2/10 is less than 4/10. So we know the US will specialize in soybeans. All right, so now we know what the countries will produce. Even though the US is richer, Japan produces airplanes, the US produces soy. So we have our example. We know what they're going to produce now. We can determine it. That still hasn't shown that they're better off from trade. So finally, we're going to have to do part 3. How do we look at the consumption under trade? How do we prove that we get to a point where the US can consume more than they could before? So the example I'm going to use is we're going to trade. And here's the trade we're going to make. So Japan is going to produce 22 airplanes that they're going to send to the United States. And the United States is going to send, in exchange for these airplanes, they're going to send 880 tons of soybeans to Japan. Does this make the countries better off? So if you go back in the slides, I found a point for each country and I plotted it on its PPF. So what I did for the United States is I found a point where they were self-sufficient. And they were self-sufficient at 30 airplanes and 3,500 tons of soy. So now remember what we offered here. I offered 22 airplanes from Japan. That's what the US is going to get. They're going to get 22 airplanes. And they're going to have to give up 880 soy. So what that means is that the US imported 22 airplanes. They exported 880 soy. So what does the US end up with? Well, it ends up with 52 and 260 and 20 tons of soy. Now, if you remember, and you go and you plot this, you can show that the U.S. is now at a point beyond their PPF. So this is like kind of, we got better technology and we didn't even get technology. So we were now able to consume beyond what we could have produced before. So would the U.S. benefit from trade here? Well, the answer is yes. As a country, we get more goods and services than we could have had before. Well, if the U.S. benefited from trade, does Japan? Well, let's look. So Japan, we're going to put them at the end point. Boom, they're going to start right there. They specialize, completely specialized in airplanes. They're going to bring in 880 soy. They're going to send away 22 airplanes. Japan also ends up at a point beyond the production's possibilities frontier. So what happens here is now Japan can produce more, Japan can consume more than they could before. Their production hasn't changed. I didn't change anything about their production. All I changed is how much they can consume. So now Japan consumes more than they could have produced. How did I know this would work? How did I know that the price of the trade would work? It works if the price lies between their opportunity cost. So if you go back and remember, the opportunity cost in Japan was 1 for 25. For the United States, it was 1 for 50. So 22 airplanes for 880 soy. Divide by 22. I find one airplane is trading for 40 soy. And 40 is between 25 and 50. Would they have benefited from trade if the trade was 22 airplanes for 660 soybeans? Would that have benefited them? The answer to that is yes, they both would have also benefited from a trade of 22 airplanes for 660 soy. Why? Because this 30 falls between 25 and 50. So as long as the trade falls between the opportunity cost, both sides will benefit. So Japan benefits because they're going to get more soy from their airplane than they could have if they decide to produce it on its own. The U.S. is happier about this trade because for an airplane before they'd have to pay 50 if they did it themselves. If they buy it from Japan, they only have to pay 30 soybeans. So the U.S. is happier to produce soybeans here and send those soybeans to Japan for an airplane. So here's kind of a table, what you'll do in the homework is consumption without trade, consumption with trade. I find the gain. This should look very, very similar, kind of the example of going through your homework. So kind of the takeaways from this is comparative advantage in trade. The gains from trade, where do they come from? They come from differences in opportunity cost. So we gain from trade by, this kind of doesn't sound right, but from exploiting our differences. Because we're all different in this world, and that's okay. But because we're all different, we all have different opportunity costs. And because of that, we're able to trade with one another. Why we're not self-sufficient in this world. Why we have comparative advantages. And part of what hopefully you decide to do is what you have the comparative advantage in. Again, comparative advantage doesn't determine wealth. It kind of determines what we do. Wealth is always going to be determined by productivity, which is absolute advantage. But just because we're richer or poorer than somebody else doesn't mean we can't gain from trade. Doesn't mean there's not an ability for us to gain. And how we do that is through comparative advantage. And because of comparative advantage and specializing, we get actually more goods and services are going to be produced in the country, in the world. And because more production is done, we get a bigger economic pie. So there's efficiency. We become more efficient. And because we become more efficient, there's this ability for all countries to gain from trade. That they will all end up with more goods and services than what they had before. So hopefully you remember from the discussion in chapter 1, if we're focused on efficiency, what are we neglecting or what's not going to be there? Right? Is we're worried then about equality. Because trade focuses a lot on efficiency, and we're okay with that. But we're also going to neglect equality when we focus on efficiency. So then we're going to have to answer the question, and we'll kind of talk about this on Wednesday. How do we weigh these trade-offs? And what can we do to try to help with this equality part? Because we become more efficient. And just like anything, there's going to be cost to trade. What we focused on today is a lot of the benefits of trade. Why is free trade beneficial? What we're going to focus on Wednesday is we're going to start to talk a little bit about these costs. What are the costs of trade? And so we spend the first part describing that trade can be beneficial and how it benefits a country and how it allows us to grow. So what I want you to do with the little bit of time we have left is I'm going to give you this question. I want you to sit down. I want you to work it. I'm going to kind of wait here a little bit, and then we'll go over the answers. But let's start trying to see if we can't do a little bit of this on our own. So I'll give you two countries, Argentina and Brazil. If you looked ahead in the slide, you can see the answers. But let's assume we didn't. And for simplicity, I made them the same. They both have 10,000 labor hours per month to use. So look at coffee and wine. So if it was me, what I would do first is I would create a production table. So how much coffee and wine could be produced by Argentina and Brazil? So Argentina, if they did nothing but specialize in coffee, what they could end up with is 2 divided by 10,000. Is they could get 5,000 coffees. Or what about wine? Well, if we do wine, we could find 2,500 for Argentina and wine. For Brazil, well, they're going to be a little more in coffee. and a little less in wine. So the question we have first is, who has the absolute advantage in coffee? Well, we can do it through two ways. We can do it by looking at labor hours. If we look at labor hours, that answer is Brazil, because 1 is less than 2. We look at labor hours, we're looking for the lowest number. If we go to the production table, how much can they produce? How wealthy are they? Well, Brazil has more coffee than Argentina with the same number of labor hours. Therefore, Brazil definitely has the absolute advantage in coffee. What about wine? Who has the absolute advantage in wine? Well, Argentina, 1 for 4 hours. Brazil, 1 bottle in 5 hours. So Argentina is better at producing wine than Brazil. So Argentina has the absolute advantage in wine. You could also find it by looking at the production table. Assuming they have the same number of hours, which is what we assumed here, we can see that in the same number of hours, Argentina produces more wine than Brazil. So Argentina is better at making wine than Brazil. Next, you should do the comparative advantage, and how we find that is we create the opportunity cost for Argentina and Brazil. Oops. Sorry, I drew poorly. So we're going to have coffee. What does 1 coffee cost me? What does 1 wine cost me? Oops. I run out of space. You have paper. You should be a little better at this, or it's a little easier. So for Argentina, what does 1 coffee cost? Well, I write my equation. It's 5,000 coffee equals 2,500 wine. I divide both sides by 5,000. 1 coffee costs half a wine. Therefore, 1 wine costs 2 coffee. For Brazil, it's 1/5 and 5. So the question asks, who has the comparative advantage in wine? Argentina has a lower cost. Therefore, Argentina should have the comparative advantage in wine. So here's the nice little clean table for that. So here's the answers for what you should have found. Again, spend time making sure you can come up with these numbers. Oftentimes, students see it done in class, or they're going to see it done online. But replicating the process is difficult. Just because you've seen how it works doesn't mean you're going to get it on the first attempt. Some of you will. And that's going to be wonderful. They're not quite opposite, Naya. Here they're opposite, but not always are they going to be opposite. Well, they're going to be reciprocals. It's not, they're always going to be reciprocals. They aren't going to necessarily be opposites. There is kind of a rule here. If it's simple, I won't give you a lot of simple ones. It's simple. If the absolute advantage is split, so if you ever have a spot where one has the absolute advantage, see here, if we looked at it, Argentina had the absolute advantage in wine, and Brazil had it in coffee. If I'm just, it will also then translate to comparative advantage. That's the easy one. So if you have the absolute advantage and it's split, then the comparative advantage, of course, will always be split and will always be split the same way. Right, if the opposite is split, so here, if Argentina has the absolute in wine and Brazil has it in coffee, comparative will turn out to be exactly the same. Which should make sense. It's always this, not always, it's the same if they're split. The problem comes from the first one where they're not split. What happens if I have the absolute advantage in everything? So what if I'm the rich country? What if I'm better at producing everything? If you look in the book, I think the author now uses Serena Williams. He's gone through lots of examples of who he uses as the best at everything. It used to be Tom Brady. The edition before was Tiger Woods. But if they're the best at producing everything, they're better at me than everything. Is there still an opportunity to trade? That's where we use the comparative advantage. So I hope that kind of answers your question. If they're opposite, if they're split in absolute, then the comparative will be the exact same split. That's what I call that the easy problem. This is the easy problem. Most of the time we're going to spend it on the difficult problem because that one involves us actually calculating comparative advantage. So the easy problem is where they started with trade, and then we moved into, well, what if I'm better at everything? How does trade still apply there? All right, on Wednesday we'll work another example, as well as we'll talk about the cost of trade. So please spend some time going over the homework. We should have had enough discussion today. You should be able to do most of the homework. And then on Wednesday, we'll finish this up, and we can look at how I'm going to ask some of those quiz questions come Wednesday. Are there any questions? All right, if there are no quiz questions, or there's no questions,